Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Philosophical Liberal and the beginning of what is going to be now an almost a year-long deep dive exploration of the virtues. And we are starting out with responsibility. So, just so you know what we're up to here, this almost a year because there's going to be 11 months worth every month. We're going to focus on one of the virtues that we have defined as part of our philosophical liberalism statement. We are starting with responsibility, and you will find that we're going to have two sessions for every virtue. We're always going to begin with Chris and I just talking about what was in the statement, why it was in the statement, what we mean briefly, generally, hopefully, about each of the virtues. And we're each going to ask each other one of our best questions about the virtues. This is definitely one of my favorite formats to do discussions. Back when I was teaching college classes at NYU, this was one of my favorite ways to facilitate discussions often was to ask everyone to bring one best question. So we're going to ask the question of each other, but hopefully it'll be a question that will inspire you to think more about the virtue as well. So that's always going to be part one of what you'll see for each virtue. And then we're going to do a part two where we're hoping to bring on several different, just other experts, exemplars, people who we feel in their own way embody or know a lot or could share a lot about the virtue in question. But for this virtue, you're going to find that we're actually taking the floor itself because, well, I will say I feel strongly that I have a lot that I want to say about this particular virtue. So this particular session might actually be a little bit shorter than normal because we're going to think save a lot of our deep dive conversation about this virtue because I just have so much to say about this one. But I think this will be a great introduction. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you and you can read what we have from the statement and we will dive into responsibility.
Great. Thank you, Joya. Yes. So, as Joya mentioned, we're going to run through each of the virtues and just go in order as they're listed in our statement. I can't
No, I don't think
say,
we're going in order.
oh,
We're
sorry.
probably
You're
gonna
right. You're,
do the
thank,
order based on who we actually get to be the interviewee for each of the virtues
that's
and when
true.
it can be convenient to bring them on and do that. But we will
Thank you
get
for,
through all 11 in
thank you
11
for correcting
months.
me. So, we're not going to go in order, but we are starting with the first one, which happens to be the first in our list. And that is responsibility. So, I'll start with the opener that we had for virtues and then go into responsibility. We said virtues, the life of a creator trader pursuing continuous betterment, as well as the society of freedom on which those ideals depend, require the development of important virtues, including the first one was responsibility, which we defined as being proudly causal or recognizing and embracing the necessity of taking productive action to further one's life and accepting the full consequences, direct and indirect, of one's actions. And I should just say that, and that's all that we wrote there. And I should just say that for all of these, um, if you read our statement, we list each of our virtues, and then we have this kind of statement, which is meant to kind of operate as a definitional statement, but it is not by any means intended to be comprehensive to that concept. In fact, that's a lot of what these sessions in the next year are going to do for us is help build that out more. But at least at the time we were writing it, we were trying to capture what we felt was the essence of each of the virtues in our mind, and in particular, specific nuances or angles of the concept that had relevance to this question of being your best self as a creator trader and as a civic participant in a free society. So, with that said, Joya, anything you want to that's jumping out at you wanting to say in this first episode about responsibility, even just perhaps do you recall us drafting this one and any of those nuances or distinctions that we wanted to highlight here?
Well, sure, let's start at the beginning, which I'm sure I drafted, and, or if I didn't, I definitely authorized. That the most important thing about responsibility, the way I put it, was being proudly causal. And causal, I think, is the key. concept here with responsibility and why I think it's so important. And there is a reason that responsibility is the first one, at least in my mind. To me, it's the one that, in many regards, I do believe underlies the rest of the virtues. And if I had to pick one that I thought people really focus on getting one of these really strong and really good, really hearty in their lives, I would hope it would be responsibility, precisely because it is so important in the deepest sense, in this broad metaphysical way, that it's about being causal. Responsibility, the way I see it, is about being a causal agent in the universe, of being proactive, of bringing about the results that you want to see in the world, and to do so in a way where you are proud of it, where it becomes part of your identity, part of what you are excited to wake up in the morning and do, is to be a causal agent. And how you do that is essentially by taking responsibility, or even by taking ownership. Like, that's a word that we didn't use in our statement, but one that I definitely associate with thinking about what responsibility means. It means taking ownership for your actions, for your results, for how you will show up in the world. A lot to
Great.
unpack, but we'll probably even do more of that in the second session.
Yeah, we definitely can. I will say I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves me correct, which it doesn't always, that I, if not wrote, authorized the part about embracing the necessity of taking productive action, because I think I know you'll agree with me, but I know it was key for me to emphasize here that what one is taking responsibility for, the cause that you're trying to effectuate in the world, is to be productive
Yes,
and
to create value.
to create
Absolutely.
value. And so that is another key point that we want to emphasize here, because I think a lot of people in the common conception and understanding of responsibility think of it as more almost taking on duty or obligations and things like that, like almost like something that's put upon you and that you do for others. And we want to totally invert that understanding and say, no, it's something you do out in the world, number one, and it's something that is values oriented, directed at creating value. So that was just another key point that we wanted to emphasize here. And then I also think um, the other, there's always with responsibility two sides to the coin, right? There's taking ownership and responsibility. It's so like this is going to be interesting how we go through these, because a lot of times you're trying to define a concept by its own word. You know,
That's always the
want to
temptation.
I want to say take responsibility for, what we're trying to define responsibility, but it's taking responsibility for your action and then also the effects or the consequences of it.
Yes.
And this was another point, we have this parenthetical in here about both the direct and indirect consequences of one's actions. And just to give a little bit more insight into what we meant here, is I think we were trying to make clear that, um, and I suck at examples on the fly. It's something I need to work on that I will take responsibility for, but I'm just like,
There's a beautiful example right there of recognizing when you need to take more responsibility
right,
to be better at
exact
the value you bring into the world.
Right,
Yes.
yeah, but it's like, so because you can take an action and it's not, we think of like the butterfly effect or second and third order effects, if you've heard those terminologies, but it's where you do something and it's not just about anticipating how that action is going to affect the direct, person on the other side of that table, but also how it's going to affect, that would be like a direct
Yeah.
cause, but also how it's going to affect other people kind of in the second and third order ring of connection to it, maybe how it's going to affect the people in the other person across from you use their life, how it's going to affect your own life, both, in the immediate term and in the long run. All of those you could say are the quote indirect effects here. And I think what we're just trying to say, obviously no one is omniscient, and so it's not saying you need to anticipate every possible combination and iteration of potential effects that your actions could have, because then of course you would just be debilitated and frozen into inaction from analysis paralysis. But rather it's knowing, frankly, that your actions have both direct and indirect consequence, and therefore you better be sure that what you're doing is something you want to do and it's for a good reason. Because once you put that cause of your agency out into the world, those ripple effects start flowing, for good or for bad.
The way that I certainly think about this is that what responsibility means is, first of all, being proactive to think about what are the second and third order consequences, what are the ripple effects, and to maybe even take responsibility for those direct actions that can have the greatest ripple effects, which to expand your own horizon of what it is you're trying to create in the world, the productive value you're trying to bring to the world. There's that. And then also, I think the responsive responsibility in the sense that when things come up that maybe you didn't anticipate, that you still recognize that, oh, this is on me. And so it's about, oh, like I didn't realize, I might not have realized that this would happen, but now that it is, it's still on me now to figure out how to mitigate or ameliorate or find a solution for whatever it is that I have brought into the world. So that essentially responsibility is not this one and done thing. It's about the ripple effects, and it's about continually taking ownership for the unforeseen consequences as well. At least that's what it means to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. And I did, while you were talking, kind of think through a maybe more concrete example.
Wonderful.
As everyone knows, we are strong advocates of an entrepreneurial approach to life because we both are entrepreneurs in our own lives. So we bring a lot of that perspective to the table here on these matters. And so another way you can maybe visualize this and concretize this idea of direct and indirect consequences, if you think of an entrepreneur or an engineer, a kind of business creator who makes a new product, you could say that when an entrepreneur who takes responsibility for the product that they're making in the world, you could say that the direct effect or consequence that they take responsibility for is, oh, what's the quality of this product? What is the impact it's going to have on customers, etc. But then the indirect effects could be everything from who am I sourcing from as my supplier base, and who am I partnering with to help create this, to who am I selling to? Who do I want this product to go out and serve in the world, and for what purpose do I want people to use it for? Those you could say are kind of those second, third order or indirect effects that someone who takes full responsibility in the way that we're advocating and envisioning here would take into account, or you know could take into account. I don't necessarily say there is a right answer here of how one should approach it, but I think those who do take all of these factors and players into account, like they're operating certainly at kind of the widest scope of responsibility, you could say.
Exactly. It's beyond just the direct transactional level of, okay, I'm selling this to you and I'll get my money back with some profit. But thinking beyond that, like, okay, if I'm bringing this product into the world, how is it going to affect not just the person I'm selling it to, but their family, their community? What impact is it going to have, not just directly after this sale, but years from now? Just the wider questions of like what it means to bring a certain product or service into the world. And then if and when things go wrong, because probably things will, like we are not omniscient, and there will be things that
More
you might not have ever
infallible.
thought would
Yeah.
ever happen with a particular product, to then realize that, oh, like that's still part of what you brought into the world, and you still have ownership of the continuing consequences.
Yep. Well said.
What else? So should we go to our questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
And I'm curious to hear
Our new
yours.
format. Yes. Sorry, what were you
Oh, I
saying?
just said I'm curious to hear yours. Do you want to start, or do you want me to go?
Sure. So my question is, and it ties back to a word I used earlier just now, but I think, let me think of how to phrase this. I think, like I said, a lot of people maybe not confuse because there is an element of this embedded in it, but they take responsibility, the totality of it, to mean something like duty or
Mhm.
obligation or the like.
Well,
And
so
so,
many of our responsibilities are things that are duties and obligations. They're things that we did not choose, but were
right,
put upon us, and now we
right.
feel responsible. Yes.
Or we chose them at one point in time, but maybe we didn't, like, oh, we decided to have a kid, but then like we forgot that that's going to be a lifelong endeavor and you're going to forever be making choices between the things you want to do and the things your children want to do, things like that. Um, so the question is how, based on what we've now just said and defined as responsibility and this kind of more proactive, consciously directed, productive action, um, how does one how does one think about taking responsibility properly understood in the way that we're defining it, but not kind of confuse it into taking on an unchosen obligation or an unearned duty. In other words, how does one avoid that confusion and that potentially gray line between taking responsibility for the things that you want to versus feeling like you owe somebody or something an endless commitment, loyalty, whatever.
I think the answer is in the word that you said, that it has to be chosen. That choice is what's key here. And this will probably get into our conversation next time. But, I've been doing a lot of work on helping people develop their mission in life, and thinking about the process of it. And here, like, one of the reasons why responsibility is so close to my heart, because I see that responsibility and this whole act of taking responsibility is crucial to what having a mission in the world is all about. And what I've noticed about how people even develop what become their life's work, their life's mission, that it can come through several different avenues. It could be something that is discovered about perhaps themselves, their talents, their potentials. It could be, something that, like, sometimes it comes from a long gradual process of accumulation, and then it, like, from that, like, the mission just kind of like cream rises to the top, I guess you could say, might be the phrase. Sometimes there is just like kind of like one catalytic encounter with someone that just like makes the mission come into focus. And sometimes it is the case that the mission comes to you from circumstances that you were born into, that you had no choice over, but that you somehow you found yourself in certain circumstances. But what I've noticed, that what is key to all of these, even and especially the missions that come from circumstances that weren't chosen, is that at some point the individual has to make that proactive choice to say, like, I am going to choose what my response to whatever this unchosen thing would be, and that's key to the mission. So, like, well, for example, because this one is very relevant to the work that we're doing with the co-creation opus we're working on, and thinking about the historical figure Frederick Douglass. But here's an example of someone who I think his life mission was clear, that is known for being perhaps one of the most ardent abolitionists ever. And he became that through circumstances that he did not choose. He did not choose to be born into slavery. But what he did choose was how he was going to respond to that, to resist slavery, to escape slavery, to then eventually speak out against slavery, to bring others into that cause and that movement, to make that his life's mission. So, this I think is even an extreme example of even when you're taking responsibility for something that was in a sense put upon you, that there's still always that deep element of choice and choosing to make it your project. And I think that is what's key, and perhaps that is the advice for people to think in their own lives. Is this something I'm doing because it is an external duty? Am I doing it because I feel I have to, because somebody else says this is what
Expects
should
it
be
or
done, this is what ought to be done, this is what you need to do? Or is it because I am recognizing the truth of the value of doing whatever this particular thing would be?
that's very helpful, and I love that volition is the key because, like so much in human life, choice and the freedom to choose that we have as human beings is is the keystone for so many things, and often therefore the way out of your predicament, because we always do have a choice, a new choice, or an alternative choice.
I mean, the slavery example is, I think, the most potent, and scholars and people who've lived through slavery or lived through concentration camps say this, that even in these sort of extreme cases of of oppression in this way,
Hmm.
of literal enslavement, or you're being subject to tyranny, tyrannical government, that there's always your choice in how to respond. Like, will you just submit and agree to go along, or will you resist? So
Right. Yeah.
there's just that it's freedom, ultimately, is what it is. It's that fundamental freedom that we always possess
The
as
freedom to
human
choose.
beings. And so
Yeah.
it's perhaps almost even perfect that it's the key to what responsibility is all about, is that it starts from that fundamental freedom that you have, that freedom to make a choice and say, I'm going to choose to take this on, to make this
To
mine.
take ownership of my
Yeah,
actions
exactly.
and to do something productive with them in
Yep.
the world. I love it. Great. Well, what do you have for me?
Right. So my question for you is, to what extent does responsibility involve a feeling? So if someone is taking the actions of being responsible, but
Mm,
not necessarily feeling responsible or identifying it as responsibility, is that still responsibility?
mm, interesting. I'm gonna try and set aside my like trying to get in your head of like where you're coming at with this question, or if you have a certain scenario in mind, and just focus on it the way
Well,
you.
let's so I think even many people in life do take on responsibilities, chosen responsibilities, without ever using that language or thinking of it in those terms. Um, maybe because they're even using some of the other language like duty or obligation,
Right. And
or
so is your
because they're
question that
just,
and
yeah,
so
or
is your question if they don't feel it as responsibility in the way that we're describing it, is it still that?
yeah,
Right? Is
or
that the
they're doing it
question?
because it's just like, oh, this is something I do, this is who I am, this is my
Yeah.
personality. There's plenty of people who are the ones who, let's say, like, take ownership and responsibility for making sure that things happen and things get done. But a lot of times those people will just say, like, oh, like, that's just who I am, or
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that's just what
yeah.
I do, without necessarily feeling responsibility or naming it as responsibility.
Yeah. My initial instinct is to say yes, it is still responsibility. Um, it's for as a sneak peek. and some maybe some news making for everyone out there. As Joya just alluded to, we are working on what we're calling a co-created opus project right now, it revolves around our theory on greatness. I won't say anything more because you will soon be learning a lot more, all more.
You
Um,
soon will be hearing lots about it
yes,
as we start taking responsibility for bringing it out into the world publicly, which it
yes.
almost is at that stage.
But the reason I raise it is because as we're literally mid writing it right now, and as I've been writing about the various planks of our greatness theory, which that's not new news in the sense that people know about that theory because we introduced it in this show earlier
Although we
this
have
year.
developed and refined it in ways that people
Yes,
have been
it's
following
expanded,
along.
developed, and refined since then. So
Interesting.
you got more to look forward to. But you know that we have this theory that consists of these different elements, or planks, as we call them. And I've realized that because a lot of even our inductive process has been looking at examples of either archetypal humans or real humans in both history and the present who embody each of these different elements. And I often find myself writing that many of the people who practiced and embodied those traits didn't necessarily know it themselves that that's what they were doing. But I don't think that that takes away from, certainly not the categorical reality, you could say, of what they're doing, that it is that responsibility, greatness, whatever, nor the moral angle, because and this may be an interesting kind of esoteric debate to have some other day, but like, does conscious intent and will have to be involved in an action in order to get like full credit, full moral credit, if you will, for it being a virtuous action? Um, I don't think so. I think we even talked about this in one of our earlier sessions about how I kind of put forth the hypothesis that many people are virtuous without necessarily like trying to be, that they're just, they're living their lives trying to be good people and kind of quote do right, kind of the golden rule, if you will. Um, but aren't necessarily thinking of it in terms of, oh, I'm trying to be a moral person and upstanding character, that type of thing. So, um, and I don't think we want to set that as a standard. So no, I think, but if I understand also where you are going with that question, I can see where, um, at least as we're defining the virtue here, when we say proudly causal, that implies this conscious intention and choice. You can't really be proud of something if you don't know that you're doing it. So I think maybe the way to answer this is and this is maybe somewhat of a dodge, but or a hedge, in that there's layers of responsibility, right? That someone can be taking ownership of their choices in their life, even perhaps unconsciously, and so you could say they're being responsible, but maybe to practice the virtue of responsibility requires that higher level awareness and conscious choice. So maybe that's the distinction, is we can say someone's being responsible in these kind of discrete acts of ownership and uh, cause and effect, but to to practice the virtue of responsibility is requires that kind of next step of effort and awareness.
Fascinating. Well, so I'll share that there's even an honestly part of a personal backstory behind my
Yeah,
asking
I'd
this
love to
question, because
hear.
this is something that I think about when I think about my own life. I look back and see, at least since I was a child, I was definitely motivated by consciously of ideas of greatness, I guess you could say. Like I definitely, even as a child, thought I want to do big things, I want to do important things, I want to do things that matter in the world. And because I had those motivations, I think I was the kind of person who essentially was taking responsibility to make progress and do things with my life. And it wasn't until at a certain point, we'll talk about this, I think, in the second session in much more detail, but when it became very clear to me, this concept of responsibility being key, and for example, like the owner versus victim mindset, and having
Mm,
that consciously in mind, that I feel that my whole sense of responsibility did reach a new level. And certainly now when I think about the virtue of responsibility, and how to really live responsibility in the fullest, most abundant sense, I do now think of it as being proudly causal, of recognizing that you have this power to be a causal agent in the universe, and taking that seriously, and making a point to do something important with that. To me, that really now does matter for the virtue in the fullest sense, which is why I know I put proudly causal at the very beginning of how we
mhm.
describe this, but also recognizing, to your point, that, like, I like the way you even described it as layers, that perhaps you don't need the fullest version of the virtue to still be, in a sense, living in alignment with the virtue, to be living responsibly. But hopefully this is even an inspiration of doing it more.
Yeah, well, and again, I think this it falls squarely within the scenario that we hypothesized about in a couple episodes back about, I think, I mean, clearly our modern world wouldn't be working as relatively well as it does if a lot of human beings weren't taking ownership of their actions and consequences. So I think that is the norm, is that most people probably are taking responsibility to some degree in their life, but not probably in this
Yet
kind
doing
of
it a proudly causal
doing
way,
it in
being a
this
proudly causal agent.
being proudly causal, right? So I think that's the difference is, and that's the value. That's why we're doing this series and why we wrote this statement and why we even are putting forth this ideal is to help, is a lot of it is helping people realize that good that they're already doing is good, and to be able to identify what they're doing and then to just be clearer about how to sharpen those efforts.
And take your good to great.
Take your good to great. I love it. That should be the motto for our entire greatness theory. Take your good to great.
Yes.
And I'll just say, my own question was also similarly motivated by kind of personal example, kind of from a different angle of I recognize that um so I think I thought of it, at least in my past, I realized that I thought of this more in terms of the concept of loyalty,
Mm,
particularly in my work, is that I always felt a strong sense of like loyalty or duty, and yes, responsibility to, like, if I took on a commitment to say, I'm going to work for you and give you my all, that I realized at points in my life, I let that kind of become kind of just like an open-ended blank check without
mm.
any kind of check-in conditions, limitations on my own part, right?
Without
That
the boundary setting
right, the boundary setting, exactly.
that would have
And
actually allowed you to bring your best work to the table.
right, exactly. And then I realized that led me to probably make some errors, at least of timing in my life,
Mm.
because I felt, oh, well, I can't walk away from this responsibility. And I probably even did consciously uh, think of it in those terms as like this is my responsibility, that I chose it. There was choice involved, and so I recognize that. And so then it was like you rack yourself with guilt, especially if you are trying to be virtuous and consistent and integrated, or with integrity, that, oh, well, I made this choice, so I have to stick with it, right? But that is not always the answer either. So that was kind of where my question came from, and I think your answer actually is the right one, because even in situations like that, even if, yes, you maybe made the choice to get into something, I think being proudly causal and taking responsibility for every day is a choice, right? Every day
Mhm,
that you wake up and do everything that you do, you choose to do it, which includes going to work and the job that you have. And so that means that every day you have a new choice to make, right? Of whether you want to keep doing it or not. And so I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that yes, we may choose obligations, but that doesn't mean we have to choose them forever. And you have to constantly reevaluate based on where your life is and the values and goals that you're after, whether the choices you made previously still are the right ones to keep choosing going
mhm,
forward. I think maybe that's the way to think about it going forward.
mhm,
That's obviously, that to me is the grayer area. I think it's much clearer when you feel like you're doing something on behalf of someone else that was imposed on you or that you
mhm,
didn't choose, then that's almost easier. To me, I think the more interesting, because it's more complicated, is these grayer areas of like where you maybe did choose initially, but um, not sure whether it still suits you down the road.
mhm. Well, I think I even have a whole, we could go down a whole rabbit hole with that too, but I almost want to put a pin in this now and say, let's save it for the next one because
Sure.
I still have so much more to say about responsibility.
Yeah,
That's
same.
why
We have a lot
I
to
definitely
cover.
wanted to keep
So
this one as the one that we talk through ourselves for
for
sure.
sure. We'll see you all next time then. Look out for
Yep.
the next episode. And this is month one, virtue one of 11. This is part one of two in our two-part for each virtue. So for the rest of this month, we will be covering responsibility. And then I guess it'll be August of 2026, where we are in the calendar, we'll move on into our next one.
Yep. So we'll see you for the rest of responsibility.